Hello and welcome to Podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. When you're ready to launch your next app, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so check out Linode. With private networking, shared block storage, node balancers, and a 200 gigabit network, all controlled by a brand new API, you've got everything you need to scale. Go to podcastinit.com/Linode to get a $20 credit and launch a new server in under a minute. And visit the site at podcastinit.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the newsletter, and read the show notes. Your host, as usual, is Tobias Macey, and today I'm interviewing William Vincent about his experience learning to code mid-career and then writing a series of books to bring you along on his journey from beginner to advanced Django developer. So, Will, could you start by introducing yourself?
My name is Will Vincent. I'm a developer and writer based in Boston. I started my career as a book editor, and I've worked at several early-stage startups on first the business and then the engineering sides, and recently published a couple books on Django, as well as writing about programming on my personal site, wsvincent.com.
And do you remember how you first got introduced to Python?
I do, yeah. So I was working at Quizlet running operations. This is back in 2011, 2012. And I had a little bit of experience with programming. I built static sites for book authors actually back in 2008 when I was an editor and said, oh man, like writing websites seems like a good idea. So the choice was really between Django and Rails, and Quizlet used PHP. So that wasn't that appealing because we were dealing with all its warts and bugs. So really I got into Python because I wanted to get into Django. I wanted to build websites. And I think first tutorials I did is probably learn Python the hard way, Zed Shaw's, and then also the invent your own computer games with Python. I think those were the two entryways, but it was definitely rocky for me. I think, now it's a lot easier, a lot more linear ways to get into Python programming.
And as you mentioned, your initial career trajectory wasn't as a developer. So I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about your motivation and experience of actually going from reading through and practicing some of those introductory tutorials to actually then working as a developer professionally.
Sure. I mean, it was really painful is the short answer. And this is right before boot camps became a thing. I mean, the way I learned how to code was I tried to do it while I was working full time, and that's hard to do, especially when you're working at a startup. And then I eventually left Quizlet, and my wife and I moved to a rural place for 2 years, and I basically was in a room and figured it out, built out my first startup with Django. So it was pretty rocky. And yeah, and I think a lot of the things I learned is because I approached it as an adult was I wasn't unquestioning about it. When you learn things, if you learn how to code when you're younger, you just sort of adapt to how it is. And the whole time I kept thinking, why is it like this? Why is local configuration so hard? Right? I still think that. Why is there a lack of good up-to-date resources? Why is this uniquely challenging to learn? There's no textbook for it, unlike almost every other thing out there. So a lot of that frustration I try to turn into my own blog posts and books, and it's given me a lot of empathy for newcomers because I learned it at a later age than some other developers.
And when you were first going through those stages of learning to program and learning to write web applications, what was your overall impression of the options available for web development in Python, such as Django and Flask, versus some of the other options such as Ruby on Rails or Node and Express in the JavaScript world, or some of the other libraries and frameworks in languages such as Java or others?
Yeah, that's a good question. So at the time, it was really, and in the startup communities in San Francisco that I was familiar with, Rails was really the big thing. Node had just come on the scene. Actually, the people who did a lot of the work, I'm going to say their names wrong, Guillermo Rausch, TJ Holowacek, were just down the street at another edtech startup, LearnBoost. But Node and Express people weren't really using those. So it was really Rails or Django seemed to be what people were using to get up and running fast. And I basically just picked one. In hindsight, it probably would have been easier to start off with Rails because there were better beginner resources at the time. But I think I liked Python just a little bit better, and I had to pick one, so I stuck with it. Yeah, it's interesting now, with a little bit more experience when I think about, I think of Django and Rails being sort of in one corner and then micro frameworks like Flask and Express on the other. David Heinemeier Hansson used the distinction of describing them as trucks versus a bag of Legos you shake on the floor. So you can tell his bias there. But, I think it's a bit of a personal preference for developers, but I'm strongly on the give me a truck, give me something that works, give me something that's tested. Even if I don't agree with every choice, I want to focus on what's new and different rather than reinventing the wheel. So Django is fantastic at that. And the more time I spend programming, the more I appreciate all the thought and care that's gone into it. I did a whole startup with a co-founder using Meteor.js in 2015. So I, learned this lesson the hard way of, the new and shiny toy is maybe fun at first, but quickly becomes a problem when you have other, you don't want to have to keep up with your framework. You want to focus on business things and new features.
Yeah, when I was first getting into web development after working as a sysadmin for a little while, I had first been exposed to Rails and worked with that for a while. And they, as you mentioned, have a lot of great introductory tutorials, but most of them just say, just do it this way, everything will work magically. And as long as you don't try to go outside of these boundaries, then you'll be fine. But as soon as you start to try and do something non-standard or that wasn't already baked into some of the considerations for the framework, then you have to then go down this rabbit hole of picking apart what is actually happening behind those covers. Whereas with Django, it's a little bit more direct about what the connection points are and how everything is wired together, which requires more upfront investment, but in my opinion, makes it a little bit easier to keep moving once you do get beyond that initial learning phase. And going actually back and forth between Rails and Django during my early development experience was fairly useful because I was able to juxtapose the way those things were done so I could take the sort of connection points that I learned in Django to understand what Rails was actually doing under the covers.
No, I completely agree. And I think if there's a spectrum, Rails is definitely, a magic box that just works, then Django, and then you get to Flask and Express. Yeah, and the more experience I have, the more I appreciate Django's middle ground, where it is a steeper learning curve at first. There is more config. I mean, just user models and user registration, you just get given that in some other frameworks, but you can customize as much as you want. So the thing I think about a lot with, magic you mentioned, especially as you become more comfortable with programming, you don't like anything that's magic. You don't trust it. And I often hear a lot of times with frameworks or new things, people saying, well, it's too much magic. A good example would be class-based views and function-based views, for example, which is not fully decided in the Django world. But when you're a beginner, everything is magic. And so I think a lot of the challenge for people learning and for people teaching is figuring out what's the progression of showing things. Do I need to dive into this side area, or can I just say, yeah, that works for now. I think a lot of that depends on who you're targeting, right? If you're targeting a true beginner, you're targeting intermediate developer, and most official documentation is for intermediate developers who are new to the framework, but not new to, say, web development. So the Django docs are a good example. The Django docs are fantastic, but they assume that you know web development, and they probably assume that you've built a couple other things in PHP or something else. If you haven't, I think this is really the big challenge with learning how to code websites is you have to learn a programming language or multiple ones, right? At least Python, JavaScript. You have to learn web development. That's its whole other field. And then you have to learn the specific quirks of whatever framework. And so figuring out how to do that in a linear way, or, because now for you and me, right? Like we've worked with multiple frameworks. It's much faster and easier to jump into a new programming language, a new framework. We kind of get where it's going. But when you're just starting out, it's all magic. It's all confusing.
And also it can be difficult if you're going straight to the deep end of building web application without having first understood just the basics of the programming language. Because one of the things I heard a lot when I was working as a Rails developer is stories of people who came into programming via Ruby on Rails and they were able to get up and running with building web applications, but then they didn't actually understand what the boundaries were between Ruby on Rails, the framework, and Ruby, the language. And so they would try to write just a command line program, for instance, and they wouldn't understand what was actually part of the language specification versus things that were added in by the framework. And similarly with Django, where it has a lot of its own APIs, you don't necessarily know, if you haven't already worked with Python before, what's part of Django versus what's part of the language itself.
Yeah, I agree. And I think part of that is, that's the challenge of learning how to code, is why are you doing it, right? I think a lot of it, I think about it in the same way as musicians. Why do you play guitar? It's probably not because you want to learn music theory or you want to play scales. It's because you want to play Jimi Hendrix or something. Same way, a lot of people come in because they want to build a game, they want to build a website. You don't necessarily want to learn programming languages, but you do need to learn them. So it's figuring out that order of how do you get enough of a taste and the excitement of building something, but also still build in the fundamentals when so many people are self-taught. So, I think that's a big challenge, right? How fun is it to grind through Python practice problems? For me, it's fun now. It wasn't fun before. Probably a computer science major would say that's fun, but I think for most people, they're more outcome driven. There's a reason why they're learning how to code rather than just diving into the internals.
And so at some point you decided that it would be a good idea to capture a lot of the lessons that you learned as far as how to actually get up and running with Django and develop an application with it. So I'm curious what your motivation was to actually go through all that work of writing down these lessons, and wondering how you figured out sort of what tone and what approach to take to make it so that people would be able to get up to speed and be effective writing a Django application as a beginner.
Sure. So a lot of it was my own notes for myself, just because there's so much to learn. And when you have a bigger project, I spent 2 years on my first Django project, you sort of forget where you started from. How, could I recreate this? And so I wanted to document my own things that I'd learned. And I also kept hearing, you keep hearing the advice, build a bunch of toy projects in whatever framework or language you're using. But there weren't at the time, and I think there still aren't that many examples of it. I mean, still, if you said, where can I find a good example of a Django blog, right? Because CRUD blog for developers, that's sort of boring, but I don't know where that exists actually. And there's many ways you could do that. If you ask 5 developers to write a Django blog, I mean, I could think of 10 different ways that would be subtly and in some big ways different. So a lot of it was my own notes. And then I thought, well, other people would probably be interested in this. I guess thinking about it, a lot of the writing happened when I was working with Meteor, actually, because I was getting a little bit away from Django and realizing I was forgetting some of it. And yeah, I just like writing. I like teaching. I like the challenge of it. I basically wrote the stuff for myself, thinking there were other people who might appreciate what made sense in my head when I was learning this stuff. And then the great thing about putting the time in is that I started getting feedback and comments from people. And so that kind of motivated me to keep going and decide, maybe make it a book, make it something real. Because nobody, what does it take to make a book? Anyone can do it these days. And a book feels much more real than an online tutorial.
And a lot of people have this conception that in order to be a book author, you have to be an expert and somebody who is well known in a given field. But as you mentioned, anybody who has the ability to write a book, because all you need to do is be able to put words together and form some sort of narrative. But then beyond that, there are a lot of business aspects of actually getting the book compiled and published and distributed and making people aware of the fact that it exists. And so I'm wondering if you can discuss a bit about how you actually approached that challenge and some of the early mistakes that you made as a first-time author and publisher.
Sure. And actually, I wanted to go back and answer something I didn't before about Django specifically, which was when I was writing this, I was looking for the equivalent of a Rails tutorial. There's that famous, fantastic Rails tutorial, and I just thought there was very little for true Django beginners. I think in general, people who know Python or Django are assumed to be much more intermediate level rather than true beginners. So that was, again, one of the major motivations. In terms of writing books, so I had a little bit of a head start that I mentioned. I started my career as a book editor. So working for a trade publisher, which is fiction, nonfiction books, but the process is very similar. So there's no magic there for that process. And then I looked online and found you can use tools. I use LeanPub to do the layouts for my book, where you can auto-generate things. And Amazon has really made huge strides in terms of making it very accessible for anyone to self-publish their books and put it out there. Something that book publishers constantly think about is that people care about the brand, just like movie theaters and stuff, or movies think you care who made the book, and I don't think, or the movie, and I don't think people do. I think they just want to see, does it have good reviews? Is it well written? The content kind of wins out. So the timing has kind of worked out well, that Amazon has made it really easy. It could be easier, but they've made it quite easy to put a book out there. You can use tools like LeanPub, so you don't have to use InDesign, spend hundreds of dollars, all these things to have a nice looking book. So really anyone can do it. The challenge is, I think the biggest challenge is, are you going to finish the book? That's probably the biggest challenge for most people, because it takes way more time than you think. And so we can talk about this. I mean, I have some thoughts on self-publishing versus traditional publishers. I definitely don't think there's one size fits all there. But I think if you have the discipline to write a book, you can publish it pretty quickly, and people just really judge it on the quality rather than who your publisher is or all these other things.
And after writing and publishing that first book about Django for beginners, you wrote a fairly detailed retrospective about the overall process and some of the economic aspects of publishing the book, and the way that the value breaks down of whether being an author is actually a viable career choice, or if you're just using that as a means of gaining attention for other ways of making a living. So I don't know if you want to talk through that and some of the conceptions that you had going into the initial process of being an author and some of the lessons that you've learned coming out of it.
Sure. So a lot to talk about there. So my initial motivations was I had the online djangoforbeginners.com site for probably over 2 years, and I slowly added stuff. And then a startup I was working with here in Boston was acquired. And so I had a little bit of time to dedicate to this. So my initial motivation was just to do the book, and I didn't think it would be self-sustaining. It was more something I wanted to do. I had the time, and I put it out, and it started selling. And I did all the things people do, playing around with price. Like, can I really charge for this? Do people value this? And quickly found that, in my experience anyways, there's sort of a roughly set price for technical books. They're expensive. They're about $40. But people don't really seem to change whether they purchase it or not based on the price. As long as it's within a given range, they want it or they don't. So that's something I learned. I think a lot of Django authors come with they're not necessarily trying to make a career out of it. They run a consulting business, or they have a little break in time, or, for those reasons, they'll do a great job on a book, but then when it comes time to update it, because Django updates almost every year now, they don't. And, that's fine to do. I think for most people, working with a traditional publisher, having someone hold your hand, handle all the things that I spend a lot of time on, makes a lot of sense. Having an editor to improve the text, not having to do layout and all these things. If the goal is just to get a book out there with your name on it, that makes a ton of sense. And I think that's most authors fit into that bucket. They write a book because they want to, not because they want it to be economically sustaining. But the flip side of that is then you don't update it. And so, a year or 2 years later, it quickly becomes out of date. And so that's sort of a frustrating dynamic for authors and also for readers. You say, well, why aren't there up-to-date books? And well, they're not up-to-date books because it doesn't pay enough for people to make it happen. The post you mentioned, I talked a little bit about the economics of royalties and all these things. And so to quickly, for people who've not experienced with books, the traditional publishers will pay something like 15% for a hardcover and 30% for an ebook. That's pretty standard in that range. And they pay little to no advance for tech books. For trade books, there would be much higher advances, but for technical books, there's not much of an advance. So, you'll get a couple $1,000s, you put a ton of time in, and as I broke down the piece, you have to sell a lot of books to make it worth your time if you could spend that time consulting or doing anything software development focused. I think the numbers I gave were, if you sold 5,000 copies with a traditional publisher, you'd make something like $40,000, $45,000 a year. Whereas if you self-publish that, you could make over 100. That would be assuming that you self-publish through Amazon, where Kindle is 35%. If your book is over $9.99, paperback is about 50%. It's 60% minus the cost of printing. And then you can also sell the ebook directly with services like Gumroad, where you get most of the income. So there's a lot to think about. I've realized that I've internalized a lot of that over the years, and so laying it out, I've been surprised how helpful it is for people. But I guess it makes sense. Not everyone started their career as a book editor.
Yeah. And also, a lot of people who get into software aren't necessarily spending as much of their time thinking about the business aspects of publishing and writing a book, or some of the different business aspects that go along with that, because they just want to write code and make something. They don't want to be concerned with all of the peripheral activities that are necessary to actually make that successful, because it takes time away from when they could be just writing more code, building more projects. So that's why there are usually a technical co-founder and a business co-founder at a startup or things like that. So it's always interesting seeing some of the ways that technically oriented people end up making their living when they're not part of a larger organization.
Yeah, you're right. And I mean, I think that's something that I really love about programmers, is they do it, the purity of it. I have an MBA, I've been around business, so that's really not the case for a lot of people. Like a site like Stack Overflow, that was mind-blowing to me, that Stack Overflow exists. If you've never worked in programming, the idea that strangers would solve your confusing technical problems for free because they wanted to, like, that doesn't happen in any other field. So I love that about programming. But business is important. If you don't think about it, it's going to come for you. A lot of times these projects, open source or books, are primarily passion projects, and at some point it becomes real work. And if there's no income coming in, you say, well, how much do I really want to do this? And that's why you stop maintaining a project, or you stop doing updates. So I think people are willing. There's a question of what level will people pay for stuff, and I think I've personally found that it's sort of the intermediate level, where beginners don't really know anything, don't value their time. They have no way to discern what's valuable. So it's hard to charge for that. Experts or people who think they're experts think they know everything. They want to read the source code and they don't want to be bothered. But in the middle, you say someone who's learning to code or professional developer who maybe doesn't know Python or Django that well. I mean, I've had people who are professional, 10, 15 years of Python experience, but they don't know web development, read my books. That's pretty amazing to me, but it kind of makes sense because web development is a whole different branch of programming. So yeah, you got to think about all that. I do have that challenge though as an author of, I write my books, I update my books, I update the code, I have to keep learning how to code, I have to focus on marketing. So that's something that, with a little bit of success, you have all these other obligations that come along, which I'm sort of dealing with now, which is a great problem to have. But, I'm going to have 3 books out by the end of this year. And how much time is it going to take just to keep them up to date and going? Probably several months, to be honest. So it's more fun to just do new stuff all the time. But if it pays the bill, I love working on books. I'm happy to do that. And I also think that, books you can look at them as a static thing, but I just view it as I'm constantly improving the books. I mean, I have to update them every year, but that gives me a chance to revisit things, to improve the code, improve how I explain things. So I find it kind of exciting to think about these books being something that just continually getting better and better and better over time.
And your point too about, it's interesting and fun to always be going on to new things, but at the same time, that means that you're not improving the things that you've already built. So if somebody has already come across your original books and enjoyed them and they want to recommend them to someone else, if you're not keeping them up to date, then that sort of organic growth of recommendations is going to tail off because people will realize that the content is no longer relevant or it's no longer accurate. Whereas if you do continue to maintain them, you're continuing to grow that brand recognition of these books are valuable, they're up to date, they're consistently reliable. You don't necessarily go into new avenues as often, but the projects and products that you have created are continuing to produce value and grow as you continue to dedicate time to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, consistency and the snowball effect is really true. I mean, I imagine you've seen that with this podcast. And, I have a personal site that I've been writing about programming for several years now, and it's only in the last year that it's really taken off. It's hard to say exactly why. Part of that is how Google does SEO. Part of that is just that, things build over time. And, I think it's a competitive advantage in some ways to be dedicated to keeping things up to date and to putting the time in to maintain and improve. I mean, I like doing it. I really like teaching. I really like the challenge of explaining this to newcomers. So I think maybe some developers prefer just writing code. I totally get that. There's times when I like doing that better, but I like the challenge. And I think, over time, you get better at doing it. And, the great thing is if you explain something like Python or Django, I mean, there's millions of people who are trying to learn this and it's helpful to them. And I think, if you're creative about it, you can make a living doing it too.
And within the realm of technical subjects, there's also a gradation of how frequently something needs to be updated, where on the one end you have something like Django, which as you said has a new version every year and periodic releases where the APIs might change and different things might be added or deprecated. And then on the other end, you have the idea of some of the more fundamental principles of programming, such as data structures, algorithms, design patterns, where you can write a book and not have to update it for, years or decades, and everything will still be applicable. So there are definitely trade-offs to be made along those, where on the end of having these fundamental design patterns, you're potentially appealing to a broader variety of people, but those lessons aren't as immediately applicable versus having a well put together tutorial of this is how you write a Django application from start to finish, where somebody can pick it up and then have immediate value from it versus just laying the foundational layer that they then have to do their own building on top of. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on where to fall along that continuum and what led you to choose the sort of far end of that continuum with writing a book about Django.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think about that all the time. I fantasize about, think about J.K. Rowling with Harry Potter. It's done, right? She doesn't have to update it. The idea of being done with a book is like, oh my God, that sounds so nice. Same thing with the spectrum of the biggest audience with, writing a book on Python programming fundamentals. Python actually is changing quite a lot, right? Not just Python 3, but F strings and 3.6. And there are it's always changing. I think if I was going to do another book, I would probably be more, 3 is probably enough to maintain around Django. I mean, I picked Django just because sort of that was what I knew. And I thought it was crazy that millions of people were using this. And I found it hard to learn. Again, I guess coming out as an adult, I consider myself somewhat intelligent and hardworking, and I've just never been so frustrated in my life. And so, I deeply think that the biggest challenge in learning how to code is a lack of educational content. It's not to say that my stuff is the best. I think it works for some people. There are a lot of different teachers, but everyone's trying to learn this stuff. Why is it so hard and abstract? Same thing with the fundamentals. I mean, I've half written a book on algorithms and data structures because I think if you approach it differently, it can be very accessible. I think if you just, what is it? The Corman's book is the famous one on algorithms. I mean, it's a math book. But you can make it all relevant. I think if you start with, here's some goal we want to achieve, and we can use data structures or programming principles to get there. I think that makes it much more accessible. In the same way that if I think back to high school math, learning calculus, there was never any real world application of it. But I've heard of teachers who will do things like have a robotics class where you need to, move the arm. And so you need to calculate the distance, under the arm or something like that. And then you say, okay, here's the problem. How do we solve it? Oh, boom, calculus. In the same way, I think all the programming fundamentals can be taught in terms of here's a real world problem and here's how we can solve it. And here's how we can solve it, in increasingly better ways. That's what's really interesting about data structures and algorithms. But I think it's often just thrown at you to memorize and kind of drill and kill. And so, this is, again, I think what's challenging with computer education right now is if you take computer science as an undergrad and you've never programmed before, that's really, really tough. You have a lot of classmates who've been coding for a while, and especially if they've been, hacking away on web dev stuff or games, by the time they come to see the data structures and algorithms class, it kind of makes sense. They've seen where they could have used that, where it would have helped. But if you're just seeing it for the first time, it's just kind of math. So I think having that perspective and sort of how you start teaching it is really important. So yeah, if I did another book, I probably wouldn't do a Django one because I think I have a long list of things I want to add to my existing books on Django to make them better and have new features. But I'd love to tackle the challenge of Python itself and data structures and algorithms. I think you could make it a lot more interesting than the way it's currently taught. So that's a long answer.
So when somebody is looking for resources on how to solve a particular problem, there are generally a lot of very surface level beginner tutorials or blog posts. And then there are also at the other end, a lot of very detailed, very expert oriented descriptions of what's happening at very deep levels, but sometimes it's hard to find a detailed presentation at an intermediate level for somebody who knows what they're doing, but they don't necessarily want to have to delve down to the bits and bytes to understand, at the very basest levels what's happening. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on how to create and promote the creation of this useful intermediate content.
Sure. I mean, I think we need more content, period, whatever level. I think, I actually think there isn't enough beginner level content. I hear that all the time, and I still just don't think that's the case in terms of, up to date, good beginner content. I don't think it's there. I mean, I think in some ways maybe it's better on YouTube than it is with written content. But intermediate content, for me, I like the challenge of, going a little bit beyond. But I mean, once you get advanced, I like the idea of there being sort of agreed upon things. But once you get advanced, everyone does it differently. I mean, even the fundamentals, as I mentioned with the Django blog, like people would build that differently. So I think intermediate is more just saying, okay, you know how to build a simple Django site. Now let's do CRUD. Like now let's do a custom user model. Now maybe we'll do something with channels. Maybe we'll, so in a way, everything is kind of intermediate. And if you think it's advanced, I think you should think about how you can explain it at an intermediate level. That's my bias. But I'm always trying to simplify. I mean, a good example of that with Django is with the user models. That's something that I found incredibly confusing at first. And a lot of the traffic to my personal site is around, I think actually the top post is around how to do user registration in Django. And there it's a little bit of a question of levels. How do you do that? When do you introduce the custom user model? So these are kind of the beginner intermediate questions that people wrestle with. And I guess I think if it's explained well, everything is intermediate level. I'm suspicious of things that are advanced. I think a lot of times it's poorly explained.
And as you mentioned, after writing the beginner Django book, you then went on to write two more, with one focused on building REST APIs and then the other focused on some of the more advanced aspects of building and managing and deploying Django applications. So, wondering if you can talk about the relative experience of writing those books from scratch versus the initial book that you wrote that was a composition of a lot of blog posts that you had accrued over the years.
Sure. Yeah. So the first book was Django for Beginners. I actually, the site it was intended as an online book. So separate from the posts, I did have introduction in various chapters, and that was a great experience in that it was copy edited for me because so many people looked at it and gave me feedback and encouragement. So even though I published that beginning of this year, but I had been working on it for probably over a year. The second book, REST APIs with Django, I just wrote on my own, and that was because I wanted to get the information out. And that experience, was radically different. I wrote the book fairly quickly in hindsight, but then I had the manuscript and I didn't have people to look at it, right? I can't charge for this if I'm not 100% confident that it works and it's good. So it took about 6 weeks of, I just made a dream list of developers and emailed them and said, would you look at my manuscript? I interacted with Tom Christie, who wrote REST APIs with Django, and a whole bunch of other very prominent names. And everyone responded, and many of them did take the time to look and give feedback, as well as I had a list of early readers to my first book who were willing to go through it. So that process was a lot different. It wasn't as satisfying for me, but it was maybe faster overall, and it's sort of two ends of the spectrum. The third book that you mentioned, Django for Professionals, I'm currently working on and we'll have out by the end of the year. That's really a real world Django book, because there's so many things I left out of the first book in particular, just to keep it simple. So this is one that will go into security, into performance. It's going to build an online bookstore, so we'll do Stripe and billing, environment variables. We're going to use Docker and Postgres locally. So, it felt weird to write a Django for Beginners book and then be like, okay, you're on your own. But the things in there aren't enough to get you to where you would really do like a new startup on your own. So the third book is sort of trying to wrap that up and have a progression throughout the series.
And as you mentioned, you feel like there's not enough content in general, but also that books, and technical books in particular, are difficult to make work from an economic perspective if you don't have some other business that you're promoting through the book. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on some of the other ways that we as a community and as developers should be working on improving the accessibility of programming as a pastime and as a career, and some of the formats that you have found to be most effective beyond just technical books.
Sure. So the first part is, I think I wish there were the equivalent of egghead.io and front end masters for Python and Django. Maybe there is and I'm not aware of it, but something where you can have a day job as a developer and you can do smaller courses and just focus on the courses, and someone else will handle the marketing and the payments and everything for you. I think the reality is, to be a good programmer, you have to be programming, and it's really hard to full-time create content and keep up your programming chops. So that would make it easier. That does tie in though to format. There's books, and then there's videos, and videos are, when I look at people who've are able to do content full time, I think basically everyone's doing videos, which is sort of interesting. And I hear, widely different things from people who create videos. I think, people are willing to pay more for videos than they are for a book. Videos can be, in some instances, faster to make than a book. I'm often thinking, why can't I just talk through what I'm writing here? But if you have to update it all the time, like Django, redoing a video takes way more time than editing a book. So I think that's the challenge right there. But it seems like video is, it's an unresolved question for me. I think I'm probably going to try doing some videos next year. Probably start on YouTube and then maybe use a platform for it, and probably for my own content. But I'm not really sure. I ask people all the time, and I expected maybe to hear that people preferred videos, and maybe it's just my age, I'm 37, that I like books too. But I think it's pretty different person by person. If I would guess, I think total beginners like videos because they don't know how to do anything. And so to see someone do it from scratch is helpful. But once you get to intermediate level, I kind of like being able to skim and go as fast as I want, which I can in a book and I can't in a video. So yeah, that's something I'm going to explore. I like the idea of having content and using it in different ways, because this is something content creators juggle, is that it doesn't have to be new to me. I know a number of authors who've done video versions of their books, and the videos tend to do a lot better. So that's sort of an obvious thing that's staring me in the face, but means figuring out how to do videos and putting the time into that. So it's just time, right? That's really my biggest challenge, is figuring out how to balance it all and figure out what works for me, because it's easy to get burned out doing this.
And have you moved now to relying on content creation and sales of that content for your primary source of income, or are you also doing other work in addition to writing books and, as you mentioned, starting to get into producing videos?
Yeah, I mean, I think by the end of this year, I'll be at the point where the content creation will just about do that for me. And, initially, I think like a lot of authors, I thought I had a little bit of time after the acquisition to do this, and I thought it'd be a fun thing to do, and then I'll go, get another job. But yeah, it seems like it might be something I can actually do full time, which I enjoy doing. Ironically, the challenge is if I spend all my time writing books, I like working with other really good developers to learn things in a way that you can't when you're just Googling and Stack Overflowing on yourself. So I'm not quite sure what that balance is to, keep my own skills sharp, but also be able to write full time. I mean, probably for me personally, if I had a dream job, it would be three things. It would be, creating content, it would be coding, and then it would be doing in-person teaching. I was able to do some in-person teaching. I taught at Williams College 2 years ago and really, really, really enjoyed that. I'd love to do more of that. But the irony is that pays the worst by far out of all of these things. I only reach 20, 30 people in a class versus, there's 20, 30 people on my website right now. So yeah, for me personally, it's probably a combination of the three. And to like wrap it around your original question, it's something that I'm going to be focusing on full time going forward.
And for other people who are considering going independent and not working with a larger company, what are some of the lessons that you found to be most useful that are not as widely publicized that would help others who are trying to get into the same situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think having done I solo founded my first startup, and then I worked with others on the other ones. That was a great experience in terms of working alone and taking care of my own time, because to go from a normal job to like full-time writing a book, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. I mean, a lot of people just can't work on their own. There's a lot of challenges to it. I think it's really just personality. So the fact that I had been doing my own thing or working in some early stage startups, I already had the discipline to do it. The big shift when you go to doing your own thing versus a company is, in a company you have to spend more hours in the seat if it's a physical company, but your productivity is a little bit harder to manage. When it's just you can, I'll have days where in 2 hours I'll get more done than I did, I would in a couple days at a company. But the flip side of that is sometimes I'll be frustrated that I can't, code and write for 8-10 hours a day. At least personally, I just can't. I have to take breaks. So for me now with my schedule, I wake up, I do 3 to 4 hours of writing and coding, take a little break for lunch, and then I can do a little bit of that stuff, but really I need to switch gears and focus more on marketing and, things that are a little less mentally taxing, but still important to do. So I think that's a big kind of eye opener, is once you do have the time and autonomy to choose how you spend it, you kind of hit upon the limits of your of your own brain. I think a lot of programmers also feel this way in terms of like really thinking kind of work. It's hard to do more than 3 to 4 hours a day. So I think becoming okay with that is something I'm working on. Hopefully if I get this to be self-sustaining, the idea is that it's just purely outcome oriented. No one cares how much time it takes. I just need to end up with good quality content. So if I can do it in 30 hours a week instead of 50, I should do that.
Yeah, and as developers in particular, one of the other things that's definitely very important is, as you mentioned, even just mentally, you can't spend all of your time just coding. But from the business perspective, if that's all you do, then you're not going to be in business very long because you do need to
Yep.
you do need to continue to do business development and marketing and trying to consider sales pipelines or making sure that you, if you're in the content production space, that you have ideas queued up and plans to be able to execute on all of these things to make sure that you still have the time to actually write code or create content or do the things that you set out to do originally with the business. And if you really, really don't want to do it on your own, then find somebody else who can handle all of those other things for you so that you can just focus on the coding or the content creation or whatever it might be.
Right. No, that's exactly right. I think of Wes Boss is a prominent content creator, and he often talks about developer Wes and business Wes, and he's absolutely right. Right. I mean, I need to do a website. It's like, oh, I want to do it with Gatsby and React and stuff. It's like, no, that's that's the developer side of my brain who wants to just learn all the time. The business side is like, just throw it up with Jekyll, get it done. And yeah, there's a whole host of those things. I mean, I think the thing is for me and for a lot of people who worked in startups is the variety is fun. I like the variety. That's part of why I like web development is because it's so broad, but it's not for everyone. And even with I didn't mention this in talking about working on books on more of a full time basis. Once you have some sales, then there's all this other stuff you have to deal with. I mean, taxes, setting up accounting, setting up your FreshBooks, all these things. It just takes time. So, if there were like a service for self-published authors that would handle a lot of this stuff, I would do it in a heartbeat. But the problem with books is most people don't make enough for it to make sense.
Yep. Well, there's a business idea for someone else.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think, and I think at a very meta level, there is a question around, is books the right format for tech content? In some ways, a online only subscription, even text-based subscription site makes more sense in that you would, be monthly subscription or something because there's a cost to the creator to keep it up to date. You don't have to go through Amazon, so you have the email address because marketing, you need to get the email address, which is something when you sell through Amazon, I don't know who those people are. I can see what country they're in, but I don't have any sort of ongoing relationship. So yeah, I think the more you do content, the more you realize the value and the importance of marketing and emails, relationships like that. And yeah, that's stuff I think about. I mean, I think with my self-published setup, I treat the books as ongoing things anyways, but I'm not sure if that's the right format long term. I think text-based is, and I guess without giving too much away, I've been surprised by the reach of Amazon. When I started, I thought I would sell more books directly from my personal site and from blog posts I've written, but the volume is higher on Amazon, though the cut I get of it is less, so it sort of balances out. But yeah, Amazon has big reach, and when people go on there, they want to buy something, right? Whereas you could have 100,000 people looking at your blog post, but how many of them then want to learn something else or then want to spend money on a book? Of course, I'll go in circles here. Flip side of that is on Amazon, they're only in 7 countries for paperback and 13 for Kindle. So there's something like 200 countries in the world. So those are people who can only buy the ebook version. And even then, there's some of them in countries, Iran, that don't have access to the international banking system, so they can't pay with a credit card. So yeah, there's all these, it's fascinating. There's all these things that come about, and I'll probably write in another 6 months, write up what I've learned to save some other people the time that it's taken me to learn all this.
Yeah, and without spending too much time on this aspect of it, as you were mentioning, there are the global considerations for content creation where a predominant amount of the material that's available is written in English, and that's not necessarily going to be the most accessible for the global audience. So if you're looking for something to be able to make a name for yourself and you either are a non-native English speaker or you are multilingual, then consider creating content for people who speak those other languages because they're really going to appreciate that because it reduces the cognitive load of something that's already difficult enough on its own.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something as a native English speaker, it's not always appreciated is just because someone can code in English doesn't mean they're fluent in English. And that's actually something I think about a lot in terms of, should I do translations of my books? I've been fortunate to have some offers from, publishers in big countries that, have a lot of developers, and as well as, so the question is, do I go through traditional publisher in say Brazil, right? There's a lot of programmers there, or do I work with volunteers and manage that? For now, I'm just not focusing on it until next year. But in the bucket of beyond content creation, thinking about translations, if you're a native English speaker, and certainly if you are fluent in other languages, absolutely, there's huge markets to extend programming because it's so global. So that's a big opportunity for people, and I think it's a little bit unfair that Python's in English if you really think about it, right? But I guess it makes it a little bit easier for native speakers.
And are there any other aspects of content creation or book authoring or some of the business aspects that go along with it that we didn't cover yet, which you think we should discuss before we close out the show?
I think your questions were pretty good. I mean, I think like all things, you need to do it for the right reasons. So a lot of times that comes out of a desire to put something out there, and then making money is secondary. But I think you can make money off it. Don't be afraid to charge. Don't be afraid to market. And if you like teaching, I mean, I've always liked teaching. I've always taught. I mean, I tutored in college. I taught briefly after college. So to me, it's something pleasurable. But not everyone feels this way. So if you have those overlapping diagrams of you like to code and you like to teach, and then if you throw a third in, like you know how to market, which is the one I'm working on, I think that's a pretty powerful combination. And there's millions of people trying to learn this stuff, so the opportunity is there.
All right. Well, for anybody who wants to follow you and the work you're up to, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And with that, I'll move us into the picks. And this week, I'm going to choose a podcast I started listening to recently from the folks over at the Changelog Studios. It's Practical AI, and one of the hosts is Daniel Whitenack, who works on the Pachyderm project. And I actually interviewed him for the first episode of my other podcast about data engineering. So it's a great show that covers AI from, as they say, the practical perspective. So it's worth listening to, even if you are not actively engaged in that area of technology. And so with that, I'll pass it to you, Will. Do you have any picks this week?
Yeah, I got two picks. The first is, and I apologize, this is slightly self-serving, but I think it'll be of interest to listeners, the awesome Django repo, which is just a repo of things Django related. That's a GitHub awesome Django, and it's the one with my username, Tobias Vincent. So that's just a list of, it's curated, but sort of a best picks of third-party packages, tutorials, books that are of interest to people learning Django. I guess the second is a book, actually. It's called The Digital Doctor, that I just finished reading. That is really, really eye-opening, talking about the healthcare systems, how digital records have come about and kind of where they are. And so much of it is universal with any system where you have, people that used to sit, doctors and nurses used to talk to one another. Now they're just staring at screens typing. The idea that you have, now information and knowledge. So you have all this information, but you have not necessarily more knowledge about things, and even things about how this idea and pattern carries over to things like pilots. Pilots used to talk the whole flight, but now they're both looking at their computers. So it's pretty interesting. Look at medicine, also just technology in general. I mean, everyone is staring at their computers all the time, and how can we make that better? I mean, even the fact that jumps out at me is ER doctors spend 44% of their time on the computer, and that's, to me, one of the professions where I think most of people, working directly with other people, saving lives, and yet they're required to do all these things and work with these systems that have been introduced in the last decade, and it's just radically changing everything. And I think a big opportunity to improve, but also to understand why things are complicated. If you have, every time I go to the doctor's office and peer over at what they're using, I think, how do they, it looks just like the worst legacy software ever. And this book kind of explains how we got to where we are.
All right. Well, thank you for taking the time today to discuss your experiences on writing books about Django and trying to help others learn to program and learn web development. So I'm sure that others will enjoy reading those and learning from you. So I appreciate that, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Great. Thank you.